Hello, friends. How's it going? It is Michael Parker, and welcome back to a new episode of Michael Parker. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is astrology. And I've always got a lot of questions from people about why astrology and how does that work? Well, we're going to find out today with a guest that is a dear friend of mine for well over 20 years. She is a very gifted astrologer, and her name is Michelle Prentiss. And I'm going to read some about her so you'll know who we're speaking with. Michelle is a second-generation astrologer who began her own journey of learning the art and science of astrology, as well as many forms of divination under her mother's guidance more than 30 years ago. Michelle's general focus is holistic wellness astrology combined with multimodality intuitive guidance that synthesizes astrological information with intuition, divination, and energy work. Her intention is to facilitate an experience that uplifts, guides, and supports her clients' individual soul journeys. Michelle has held an astrological practice for over 25 years and is a member of ISAR, which is the International Society for Astronomical Research, and OPA, the Organization for Professional Astrologers. She's also an attuned Reiki healer and certified integrative nutritional health coach. That's a mouthful. How's it going, Michelle?
It is a mouthful, yeah. And of course I've done other things too. But
Just so you know, I met Michelle 20 plus years ago when we were both working in the music industry, which was kind of our shared interest. But if I remember it pretty well, I think you and I connected kind of on the metaphysical level very early on. And I would go so far as to say music is in itself a metaphysical art form.
oh yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that it is so, I always sort of equate astrology a little bit to music and also to math, that it is an equation. You put it together and it creates a vibration, or it's about vibrational energies working together, melding together to create something. So, yeah, there's a lot of connections between music and I would say astrology. But it was also that it was probably my mother's two greatest loves as well. So I grew up with that, both music and astrology.
Tell me about your mother, because you are a second generation astrologer. And is it because of your mother's influence, or is it carrying on the family tradition, or is it your own innate interest in the topic, or all of the above?
Oh, yeah, definitely all of the above. And it's interesting because, I have two younger brothers who very much kind of ignored that. But my mother was, when we were growing up, always, practicing astrology. I mean, we grew up watching her give readings, and that was in the time where everything was hand drawn. It was pre-computers, which is pretty amazing that there was a time, but it wasn't that long ago. So I would observe her even as a child, creating charts, and she would do astrology, numerology, and tarot. And because for many years we actually lived in a communal home, we lived in a commune, there were a lot of people around for her to do charts for, and we watched that. So I certainly watched it and was aware of it. And I think that my mother first decided to learn about astrology as well as many other forms of metaphysical studies and thought, including Jungian psychology. And she was also involved with I would call it the thought of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which were the early 20th century. I would almost say like revivalists or early magical traditionists. So she was involved with that too, or a group that practiced that. Kabbalah. My mother was half Jewish, so she felt that I guess the mystical tradition of Judaism also was in her soul too. So it was like everything all converging, and I watched. So for me, it was a way of learning to cope with my adolescence, as we all do. And I think that many people that are professional astrologers, they'll have some opening time period. Often maybe it's their Saturn return between 28 and 30 or 27 and 30, or it's their teen years, where they begin to question. And so I've really been looking at astrology since I was probably 12 or 13, and reading tarot too, under my mother's guidance. She would give me a book or show me how to do it and then just say, what do you think? So it really was through doing charts that and working with other people and observing astrology in my own life that I was able to really see its relevance and potency, even though, of course, like you said, we probably have 10,000 years, because we have found that Paleolithic, even Neolithic societies were somehow observing the movements of the stars and the moon, the planets, which they called wandering stars. But astrology really, as we know it, I guess, in the Western world, became the most organized, during the Babylonian time period. And then the astrology that we practice now became codified in Ptolemaic Egypt, having been brought from the cultures of the Middle East, and we're still practicing astrology in many ways. It looks very similarly to how it did over 2,000 years ago.
You just did a great job of explaining something that I was going to talk about, because what I'm leading up to is this idea of why astrology works. And part of the reason that I like to look at the history of astrology is I believe, and I've said this many times on many shows and to individuals, that the sky was television for the ancients. And they looked at it every night and they began to pick out symbols, and they would watch as things moved across the sky. And they were able to then associate the movements of these things with things that happen in their own environment. And I was reading today that there are lunar cycles that are like 25,000 years old in cave art. And then you mentioned Babylonian astrology. And recently, I was in Turkey, and I was at Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,000, 12,000 years old, and there's these T pillars in it that have all of these animals and symbols on it, and one of them is a scorpion, and I'm a Scorpio. And now scorpions are indigenous to that part of the world, but I spoke to some archaeologists who are working on it, and they're saying, well, as far as we could tell, there is no astronomical significance of all this. I beg to differ. But the point is, so this goes way, way back in human history and cuts across many cultures. There's Babylonian, there's Egyptian, there is Chinese, there is Vedic Indian, there is astrology that was in the Mesoamericans, and we know it through the Mayan and Aztec calendars. So this is something that's gone on for a long time. And my argument is you don't keep doing something if it doesn't work.
Well, absolutely. I mean, in fact, in many ways, that is the scientific method, isn't it? Right? It's to reproduce or replicate something under some form of control and for it to actually have some result, right? I'm a very pragmatic mystic. I like things that work. And that's why I talked about in my introduction to myself in the bio about being a holistic wellness astrologer, meaning that your astrology shouldn't just be something that is theoretical. Okay, it can be practiced, it can be used for you now. The idea of astrology as a tool for self-knowledge, but also a tool to discover cycles, energetic forces at play in your consciousness, energetic forces at play in the collective consciousness, and how we can work with them. That's where astrology is incredibly useful. And it is, as you said, observable, and has been in use and been in working use for thousands of years. So it isn't opinion oriented. Like when we talk about the planet Saturn and we talk about the forces of the energetic forces of the planet Saturn, we're not necessarily talking about the material forces. We're talking about the energetic forces on probably like a more of a spiritual level, right? But these energetic forces are at play in human consciousness, and they've been observed over thousands of years. And that connects to the idea of what the ancients used to call the sympathy of all things. And to your idea of how our mothers and fathers would look up into the night sky and see the planets and the stars as they moved, and they'd see the lunar cycles. And we've lost sight of that now with with modern light. We can't see them anymore. And for anyone that's been anywhere where you can see the dark sky, the night sky, it's profoundly immensely intense and moving. And so the idea here is that there was this correspondence or sympathy with all things. It connects with a lot of different things in nature, the design of nature, the golden mean, how all of these different things that are just all connected. And the idea spiritually that we are individual yet interconnected. And that's the idea of how most astrologers, modern astrologers, see astrology. We don't understand the mechanism yet. Okay. And that's the piece between, science or, astrology, which is essentially meaningful astronomy, and astronomy, because there's been a divorce between, the world and meaningful world, or the symbolic meaningful world. There's been a disenchantment here.
You mentioned that your mom was also a Jungian analyst, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Carl Jung said very famously that if he could see a person's natal chart, he could take 10 years of therapy off.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm actually in the middle of a 1 year, 1.5 year course in applied Jungian psychology with the Jungian Institute in South Africa, which is just unbelievable. It's an incredible course. But yeah, and I have all my mom's old. My mother never became a Jungian analyst. She just studied Jung, but she never put it into practice, which is what she did with a lot of things. Like she
Sure.
studied music, she studied Jung. She was very interesting autodidact too. But yeah, so Jung did say that Jung was also kind of like in his time canceled
Yes.
from the scientific community, from the intelligentsia of the time, because he went there. He was actually really interested in the things that we call supernormal or paranormal. He was interested in the psyche. He felt the sympathy of all things, and really kind of explored it. And he used astrology as a form for his archetypes, which then became, Jung wasn't completely canceled. We understand him as the true grandfather, the protege of Freud, but as the true grandfather of depth psychology, who gave us words like archetype and collective consciousness and things like that. But, he his work has produced things like the Myers-Briggs, personality profile. And so we're utilizing a lot of stuff that actually came from, as my mom said it, astrology gives us 10,000 years of psychological insight. And it is psychological in the sense that it is the psyche, but the psyche can be personal and collective, It can be
Yes.
like the human psyche.
Well, the reason that I'm leading up to all of this is the question that I get from people quite often who don't know anything about astrology is, why does astrology work? And you have a video on your site that I think explains this all very well. You call the natal chart the psycho-spiritual DNA of a person. Explain that.
Yeah. I don't know where I came up with this, whether I thought of it on my own or not, but I think it's the easiest way to explain it. So the idea here is that, and I think that that Jung may have also said this, is that all things that are born in time carry the quality of that time. And in astrology, we're always looking at the time, right? The horoscope means our marker, like our watcher, our marker. So much of it, astrology itself, astrologos, word of the sky, the idea here is that we look at time, we're looking at it from a qualitative standpoint. But the qualitative standpoint of this time is psychological. It is consciousness oriented, both collective and personal. So the idea here is that at any given moment in time, there is a quality of time which is synchronistically, you could call it like expressed or
Imprinted?
imprinted, or just mirrored by the position of the planets in the solar system. And that also includes, if you want to add in them, asteroids and fixed stars, and so many things, right? And so when you're born, based on the latitude and longitude of the place, the exact hour and time, the planets and the sun have a particular, in the moon, have a particular position. And we look at that. That is, we take all of those astronomical details and we put them into a structure. The astrological chart, which I mentioned, was really kind of structured and codified in Ptolemaic Egypt. So, maybe we're not sure exactly when, maybe 200 or 300 years pre-Christ, right? When we got that. Although astrology is thousands of years before that. We're sure of that. And so we look at every single planet, and those planets have energetic forces. The signs that they are in are the expressions of those forces. And the relationships that they have to each other are the relationships that those forces have within your psyche. The astrological chart with the 12 houses represent arenas of life. So we're looking at planets, which are, you could say, are kind of like a who's the player? Signs, which are kind of like what's the player doing? And then the houses are like the where's the player working? So in that way, you contain multitudes, right? So every planet has an energetic force at play within your psyche. And those energetic forces are expressing themselves in particular ways throughout your life. And in that way, you can call your astrological chart a psycho-spiritual DNA because it describes the building blocks of you. Now, those are building blocks. We know, and when we experience ourselves, we're in our body. We feel our body. We have perception that is sensual, right? We know our body, but we also know that we're more than our body. Why? Because we can feel ourselves in our body. We can actually observe ourselves thinking. And in some instances, people can even observe themselves outside of their body. There are many different ways that we perceive our reality, but we mostly consider ourselves to be like this entity in a body. Well, it's kind of the same thing with the astrological chart. It's like what you're working with in this lifetime. So in that way, most modern astrologers, okay, we're not as fatalistic as the ancients in our in our consciousness. Our cultural consciousness isn't particularly fatalistic. We're very self-determined. We're very much about rugged individualism. But we sort of see ourselves as having these themes to work with, but we know that we have free will within the context of those. And most modern astrologers today, and there are many different like offshoots of astrology, and I know that you had sort of mentioned a few, but most modern astrologers today that are practicing in the Western world consider themselves to be somewhat evolutionary astrologers. We're adding in what we call the evolutionary planets like Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. And we're looking at ourselves as like spiritual beings having an earthly experience that have free will. Okay. So in that way, we are evolving through this structure. The structure is your natal chart. It can show your karma and your dharma,
Let's dial it back a little bit. That was a lot, and I get it. But for the people that I had a conversation earlier today with a very dear friend, and this person was saying, I'm really interested in learning about astrology. I just read it in the paper, but I don't know a great deal. So the problem with that is you're reading some generic blurb about your sun sign, and the sun sign is only one part of what Michelle is talking about in the natal chart. So I thought that we would spend a little bit of time on at least 3 primary indicators within the chart. And I'm going to call it out, and then you're going to explain what it is. So the sun sign is the one that everybody knows that they are. For example, I'm a Scorpio, love being a Scorpio, but explain what the sun sign is.
You're such a Scorpio too. See, and that's one of the reasons why people like hate astrology, because they're like, don't tell me what I am.
Right.
So, okay, well, firstly, sun sign astrology is relatively new. It is really a 20th century, I guess, creation, and it did come from popularizing astrology in, magazines and books and things like that. Alan Oken was one of the first big sun sign astrologers, and I think that he wrote a book called Sun Sign Astrology in, the 20s and 30s. And so this isn't, not that people didn't practice sun sign astrology prior to that, but it wasn't the totality. Mostly if you were getting your astrology done, you would have your chart cast, your entire chart. So the sun in astrology, and just firstly, the big difference between tropical astrology and sidereal or Vedic astrology is that Western astrology takes the vernal equinox as the starting point. Now, 2000 years ago, okay, when the ancients were sort of like codifying this, the at the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere, the constellation of Aries appeared. Due to the precession of the equinoxes, that is not true. Okay. Now, at that time, the constellation of Pisces is more prevalent. However, that doesn't change the fact that the very beginning of spring in the northern hemisphere is Aries. It's the vernal equinox is 0 degrees Aries. Okay, that's a sun sign. And at the time, the ancients called it after the constellation that was visible, but it doesn't really change the fact that the same qualities of Aries are true. Okay, so that's just a little aside on the difference. But the sun in astrology is essentially the time period or season in which you were born. Okay, and we have 4 seasons and we have 3 astrological signs per season. The first of every single beginning season is what we would call a cardinal sign, okay? And the middle is a fixed sign. The cardinal describes the beginning of something. The fixed is the rooted deepness of something. And the last sign of a season, every season, is a mutable or changing or adapting sign. So the sun signs in astrology represent really, in many ways, the qualities of the season. In many, many ways. And we've even had psychological studies that have been done in 21st century, Western world that have correlated health, character, aptitude, and things like that to the time periods in which you were born. Okay. So there's a lot of connection between the qualities of Aries, the sign of Aries, or a sun sign of Aries, and the time in which it's born. The sun represents in astrology your solar logos. It is like your hero's journey. It's what you're here to become.
I love the part where you say it's the hero's journey. Continue on that for a second.
It really is, in many ways, almost the most important part of a self-actualized life. Okay. And I'm using 2 words that connect with both Jung and Joseph Campbell, who wrote, the famous mythologist who wrote The Hero's Journey, combining the world's myths. So your sun sign's really important. And when you read your sun sign astrology, you are reading a very, very watered down version of an astrological report. So you can take it you can read it, and sometimes, depending on your astrology, it works. It always has a little bit in it that does work. That is, that typically when astrologers write a sun sign astrological report, they're looking at the planets in position to either the sun or the ascendant. So if you're, say, a Scorpio with Scorpio rising, the astrologers are reading they're reading or they're writing the report based on, like, as if your sun was rising, as if you were born at dawn. But if you've got, say, it's kind of complex, but if you've got, say, like an eclipse in Taurus, it is definitively opposing your sun if you have sun in Scorpio. And if you have Scorpio rising, it's also opposing your ascendant. And both those 2 things kind of work a little bit. I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the sun is in many ways the most important part of your chart.
And that is for most people who are only minutely interested in astrology. That is the one that they know. That is the one that is goes along with their typical month. But then there is the moon. What does the moon represent? Your moon sign.
So the moon in astrology is, if the sun is your external self, your hero's journey, and what you're here to do, like, in the world, right? The moon is your interior self. It also represents how you feel without thought. It is your instinct. The sun also symbolically represents your father, and the moon symbolically represents your mother, or how you receive mothering, which also includes nurturance, how you give and receive it, the kinds of things that you want, and the style in which you will give yourself. So the moon is really important to, like, happiness and getting your needs met. If all the world's a stage and we're merely players, the sun is your role. The moon's kind of like your backstory, it's like everything that's brought you to this scene.
And then there is the ascendant or the rising sign. Explain what that is.
Yeah, so the rising sign, which is the degree that the sun is rising or not in any given time. So that's why it's called rising, where the sun is. The rising sign represents the style in which you get what you want. And in many ways, it's kind of like a little bit more like your personality and how other people see you, or kind of like how you mitigate between, who you are, which is your sun, or what you're learning to become, and what you really kind of want and need, like your security, like your roots is your moon and your wings is your sun. And how do you get there? And you get there through your rising sign.
I'm smiling because in my particular case, I'm a Scorpio sun. I am a Cancer moon, both water signs, and
Cancer
then
rising.
and then my ascendant is Aries, correct?
I have you as a moon in Aries with Cancer rising.
Interesting. Maybe that's right.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm backwards. Okay, all right. Well, because I always think
Anyway,
I always think the Aries side of me is the one that's irritating people. So, but maybe
the Aries side of you is definitely strong, and if it's your moon, it's your interior, integral sense of it's like how you feel. Like you feel courageous and bold.
And you know what? You are right. I'm the one. You guys, I am not an astrologer. Michelle is, and you're right. I had that backwards. So.
But really, like, also how you're getting through life is like, I would just say, like, you're a family man.
Yes. So
you're a very sensitive person.
Yes.
But from an interior standpoint, you're also extremely bold, and I'd say also that because you have in your primary triad, and when people say like, oh, are you a double? You're like, I'm a double Scorpio, or they're talking about sun, moon, rising. Typically, right. It's like a little shorthand jargon. But your primary triad, the two, what we call night sky luminaries, the sun and the moon, they're really important. That what you are, that what you kind of like want, where you came from, where you're going, and your rising, how you get there. Those are really important players. Now we have a lot of other players too.
So another thing that I wanted to talk about, because in October, we had these eclipses. Explain what eclipses represent and the two that we just went through, what they represent.
Yeah. So every planet, as I mentioned, in the solar system, we look at in astrology, from Mercury to Pluto, and we also look at some minor planets too. But another thing that astrologers capture at the moment of birth is the eclipse cycle. Okay, so the eclipse cycle is represented in your astrological chart by something called the nodes of the moon. And essentially the nodes of the moon are elliptical points where the moon's orbit around the earth meets, which is called the ecliptic, meets the earth's orbit around the sun, the ecliptic. That point is freeze framed and considered in astrology as a point of karma and dharma. Now, eclipses have always been, and this is this is thousands of years ago, certainly in Babylonian and beyond, eclipses have been sort of like portents of change. I'm not going to say doom necessarily, but a lot of the early astrologers, they would look at it, they would see that there was an eclipse and they would think that something was happening because the sun and the moon were the royal pair, right? So an eclipse of the sun, the king is dying or the king is dead, or protect the king because something, and even in almost every indigenous culture around the world, even in our Northern American indigenous cultures, many Native Americans considered the solar eclipse to be evil, and they would go inside of their house, close everything, don't look at the eclipse, right? But the eclipses are astrologically triggers, and they represent thresholds and portals and remember, they're kind of like super new moons, super full moons. So we already have these two energies and they really create change. Eclipses in astrology are nothing to be trifled with. And I am a very open astrologer. I'm not a fatalistic astrologer, but I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, if an eclipse hits you an important, impactful point of your chart, something's going to happen.
Mine is super heavy.
It's really, that's why astrology is helpful too. It's a cosmic weather report. Okay. So for the collective, no matter what, typically we'll say during a solar eclipse, it's really a new beginning. It's things often get what we call eclipsed out of your life. Okay. A solar eclipse, because it's a super new moon too, is very much like a reset button on a computer, or like a reboot. So you've got this like really kind of like a new epoch. If it hits your chart, your personal chart, you know, like for instance, my particular midheaven, which is a point in the chart that we look at. We've got a circle and a cross in the middle, the cross of incarnation. The very top of it, your midheaven, is one of the places we look at along with the sun to sort of determine where you're going in life from a general standpoint. It was hit by this first eclipse on October 14th. For the collective, this was the first eclipse in Libra. And so every 18 months, we have a change in our eclipse cycle, and they happen at different times of the year, right? So like right now, we're having eclipses in the time of Libra, where we had this new moon solar eclipse, and then the beginning of Scorpio. So we had a lunar eclipse in Scorpio on the 28th, just a few days before Halloween. Lunar eclipses, unlike solar eclipses, are a little more intense, and they often represent endings rather than new beginnings. And I have to say that when I had a lunar eclipse directly on my moon in 2020, which happened to be just days before the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 2020, my mother died. Now there were other mitigating factors, because when something like this happens, like it isn't a situation where, everybody has to worry about a lunar eclipse, but it really is a perfect storm when you can sort of determine that something really powerful and profound is going to happen. But eclipses trigger events in the world stage. They trigger major astrological patterns, which are typically relationships between the outer planets. Relationships between the outer planets and their cycles represent big world events. They can, if they're connecting to your chart by degree, they can represent big things in your life.
For example, you mentioned the October the 14th date. So this current crisis that we have in the Middle East kicked off on the 7th, 1 week beforehand. Any thoughts on that?
This is a really profound time. And I think that this entire year now and moving into the next year, because we have eclipses in Aries, and we've got one coming up April 8th of 2024, we have the Great American Solar Eclipse again. And the last one we had was in 2017. This is a very, I would say, like martial time, ruled by the planet Mars. We've had a lot of energy, especially recently in this Scorpio, Sun and Scorpio time period. Scorpio's also ruled by Mars traditionally. Mars is what we call Scorpio's nighttime ruler. So yes, the astrology is for sure sort of representing this discord, this major discord. And all of that is also put into play by a lot of different things. One of them is, the planet Pluto and the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 2020, the authoritative and, Saturn Pluto cycles, which are from, 33 to 36 years in play. And our next Saturn Pluto conjunction is not till 2053. But Saturn Pluto cycles tell a story, okay? And this story is like, in my personal opinion, the sort of last gasp of authoritative structures, kind of almost like I don't want to banter about a bunch of like what I consider to be like millennial catchwords, and stuff like that, but patriarchal, hierarchical
Sure.
organizations are really rising up, I think, because this is kind of an end times. And I think that the Saturn-Pluto conjunction gave us a collective near-death experience, really, which, I mean, Saturn and Pluto are the Terminator planets.
Yeah.
They both represent the ends of the observable sky and what we consider to be the boundary of the solar system. So yes, I think that I think that it's not over the fighting. I think that it may get worse before it gets better, and I think that we will see that probably that we'll be getting some big energy in January of 2024 when we probably like around the ingress of the sun, because we're having a sun Pluto conjunction around January 20th, 21st, and then also around April. But I have faith because I think that there's another thing that's rising up too. So it's like astrology showing that. And yes, eclipses show often people die, like famous people die around eclipses. It's very, very common. You'll find fighting, things like that. We also do have a new Sun Mars cycle that is happening this month. That's just really showing, it's just like Mars is coming up, anger is coming up.
Well, when I think of Mars, I think about warlike, fiery, action-driven kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that most people that, you may say you don't know astrology, but that is exactly in many ways, what Mars means in astrology. It is the god Mars. It is Aries, it's the god of war. It's also how we get what we want. It's our drive.
We'll talk about Saturn as well, because I believe Saturn in the eighth house in Aquarius, and Saturn interests me. The number 8 interests me, but talk about Saturn, because I always think of Saturn as the harsh teacher, kind of the heavy, whereas, Jupiter's like Santa Claus, or, all the good vibes and good luck and everything. But Saturn
Yeah.
is the teacher. Talk about that.
Yeah. So Saturn is really important for all of us. Saturn is, from an esoteric astrology standpoint, the god of matter and form. And the idea here is in esoteric astrology is that, like, as incarnating souls, we have to we get pushed through the sieve of Saturn, and we incarnate into matter. Saturn is all about structure and form and time. So in that way, he is kind of like the harsh teacher. What's interesting about Saturn and Jupiter is that they are also the social planets. They represent both what we believe in and the structures and forms that we create. Saturn is the structures and forms we create, and Jupiter is like what we believe in. And their glyphs are actually inverted. So if you flip Saturn or you flip Jupiter, they turn into each other. Yeah. That's a key, because Saturn is like, I call Saturn, when I teach astrology, Mr. Miyagi. Okay. So like, we're like saying like wax on, wax off. I'm like, paint the fence. You think you're doing something that seems mundane and terrible and boring. And yet what you're doing is actually practicing and refining and building your character. Saturn's about building your house. Saturn in astrology kind of represents, in many ways, the things that you need to go through in order to become mature and wise. It can be your maturity and wisdom. My mother used to also say that it's what you fear too. It can represent fear, just like Pluto can represent fear. Saturn's a great teacher, but I'm Saturn. I call myself Saturn's daughter because I'm a double Capricorn. So, there's a lot there. You also have Saturn in Aquarius, which is also, Aquarius was traditionally ruled by Saturn prior to the invention of Uranus, or the finding of Uranus.
Okay, let me just say this. I find it interesting because I had a very difficult relationship with my dad growing up. We get along much better now, but he was an Aquarius. So I got Saturn in the 8th house in Aquarius. I always thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And of course, it doesn't exactly square, but it does square your sun. It is within orb of a difficult relationship. So if we were to look at your chart and like talk, first time, and talk about your relationship with your father, right? Your son is your father, right? Sun and Scorpio folks often from a karmic standpoint too. And, not everyone interprets astrology, just so from a karmic standpoint, and says like, or has the belief that of the transmigration of souls, or even of karma. And you don't have to practice astrology, but I do. I would say, looking at your astrology, the folks that are born into Scorpio, especially Sun in Scorpio, often do have an issue with father. Scorpios are what we consider to be night feminine signs. All the water and earth signs are just sort of but they're sensitive and receptive. Okay. And not only that, that square to Saturn in Aquarius says that there's like a fundamental kind of like discord, maybe not you don't understand each other, right?
Right.
But and that because Saturn is in aspect to your sun, that he's representing authoritarianism that is at cross purposes to yourself.
You just hit it, because I was going to say it's not just about my dad, it's about authority in general, which as a young man, I had a very difficult time with. And I know that that's part of the reason that I do what I do is I am criticizing authority very often for its hypocrisy. And that's part of the reason that I do this show. So I know it's not just strictly about my dad, but a issue with authority as well. And as I grow older, I have less animosity to the two things.
We all mellow
and more
out. We get
understanding.
a little
Yes.
mellower as we get older. And
Yeah.
Aquarius is about collective. Aquarius is very much about the collective.
Okay.
So that's why this is a really important time, and this is very much a time of Aquarius. At the end of 2020, we had the Jupiter Aquarius conjunction in Aquarius, which many people were saying we're ushering in the age of Aquarius. And then, of course, we are in or close to being in the age of Aquarius due to the precession of the equinoxes, which is sort of an epochal time. So we're kind of like at the end of times. There's definitely, from an astrological standpoint, this idea of end of times, right? And so Saturn is very much representative of that. But that comes back to the idea that there is no real end. There is only metamorphosis. So back to the Middle East, my intuition on this and the astrology on this is that we've been here before. This is like,
Right. Yes.
it's like, this is like we've been here before many, many times. The situation going on kind of reminds me, it's like a modern day crusades, where everybody's fighting for, who's right. And I think this is the end, and it may not even happen in our lifetime, Michael, but this is the end of the patriarchal religions as we know them. And that is, at least their major power, And so, of course, there's going to be fighting.
Well, let me ask you this as well, because when I took a position one time for a company that dealt with a lot of psychics and astrologers and mediums, which was something that I was very interested in.
I know. You hired me.
Yeah, I hired you. That's right. But I made a really good friend there, and he was an astrologer. And because I asked him, so how did you learn astrology? And he was one of those pop culture savants, kind of like I am. I can remember things from record labels that mean nothing, but I can't remember what I had for lunch yesterday. But he learned astrology. He told me, he said, he would look up famous people, be it musicians or celebrities, and then he would look up their signs. And then that was kind of the way that he learned astrology, which I think is beneficial to some people. So if you could point out just some famous people, oftentimes Mick Jagger, Madonna, Bill Clinton, these guys are all Leos, right? I mean, they're front people. Or if you see any famous people with particularly difficult or positive transits that are anything pop culture oriented astrological that you could point to right now that might make people see what we're talking about slightly clearer.
Oh gosh. Well, okay. All right, I'm just gonna say it. I don't
Go
really
for it.
like to necessarily make predictions, but
Right.
I feel like let's talk about Joe Biden. Okay.
Yep. He's a Scorpio.
Yeah, he's a Scorpio.
As was Hillary Clinton.
Yep. The last couple years we've had eclipses in Taurus and Scorpio, and that's over. So we don't have any more in this, series. We've now moved over to Aries and Libra. And I think eclipses, especially when it comes to like election years and things happening.
Let me just say this, because I don't want you use the P word, prediction. So I don't want you to feel like you have to make a prediction. I had a psychic on just a few days ago, Sloan, and I told her, I was like, I want your impressions, not your predictions,
Right.
so to make you feel better.
I know. It's just because I think that astrology is only archetypally predictive.
Sure, agreed.
And I am, trying to use astrology, but I definitely feel like Joe Biden's star is waning, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that's okay. It doesn't mean that I don't think the Democrats are going to be the ultimate winners, because I do actually. I do feel that, and the reason why I do is because of the social justice elements of the Jupiter Uranus conjunction, which is, a 20-year conjunction. The the fact that we don't have, um, we have now, even though Pluto is moving into Aquarius, there are so many different positions that I'm seeing that are taking us more into like a altruistic social justice standpoint. And I don't mean that harsh pendulum swing of like, like the liberals that they can't, create law and order and, blah, 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 blah. But I mean like just more inclusivity and more caring and more compassion for the world. So I do feel like, Joe Biden is.
I agree with you on Biden. Let me ask you this, because there are people whose star is on the rise. I'm
Mhm.
not going to say anybody in particular, but if not Joe Biden, then here again, this is an impression, not a prediction. Is there someone that you feel would take up that slack? Because I definitely have an idea who that is, but go for it.
Well, I mean, okay, so a couple years ago, I really thought that Biden would potentially pass away in some form
Mhm.
during his time in office. Just because I really did kind of feel like I saw a star waning. And I felt that Kamala Harris would rise up only because of her astrology was just so, she's like that Aries Libra combination, and we've got the eclipses there. So she's very, but the fact that she has essentially been like fully muzzled in the last several years was kind of blowing my mind. Because I
Mhm.
didn't see her like that. When she was in
Right.
California, she was not that at all. She was extremely fiery and very, very much about like justice. Now, whether that justice is collective or objective, I don't know so much. I think that she's very much about her form of justice, but aren't we all, right? So I kind of think that, but then, I mean, two things. I think that Gavin Newsom keeps coming up for
Of
me as
course,
someone.
that's exactly who I was thinking of, and I am not a fan, but he is
No,
the
I'm sure you're not. I know
he
you, but
he's the
Gavin
logical guy.
Newsom is like his face is like reverberating
Right.
constantly.
Right.
Because you know why. I mean,
Yeah.
so many different ways. But
And
of
I don't know
course,
what sign
like
he is. If I had to guess, I'm going to say he's a fire sign. I would say he's probably a Leo.
I know it's so funny. I should have prepared better. I'm gonna like see if I can find his astrology right now, and I'll give you a.
Because I tend to, everything you just said I resonates with me, and I mean, I think it's quite clear,
Yeah,
even besides
as our like Justin Trudeau.
right,
Um,
that kind of a person. Yes,
yeah,
he's good looking, and he's running essentially already. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
so
yeah,
it's not like we're
exactly.
making some Nostradamus style prediction here. It's the
No, no, and
obvious.
I mean I wouldn't, but yeah. So no, yeah.
Is he a Leo?
So his chart is very much activated by the eclipses. He's a Libra.
Libra. Okay.
So, but we have right now the South Node is in Libra, so it's a little less. I think that he may end up somehow running.
Well, I
But
think
his
he will.
Saturn is in Aries, so yeah, he's going to be a contender
Yeah,
next
for
year.
sure.
I
For
think
sure.
so,
I have zero
100%.
doubt.
So if that helps give an illustration, great. I'm happy to like talk about the 12 signs. I know that we've probably like spent too much time blathering
No,
on, but I could talk forever.
not at all. I know that we're coming up on an hour, and I told you I wouldn't keep you longer than an hour. But anything else that you see conspicuous on the world stage or in pop
Yeah,
culture or anything
yeah.
astrological? Does anything come to your mind?
Well, okay, I want everyone to look out for January, for there to be some pretty major stuff, but also for April. April is such a pivotal month in our collective,
Explain.
with the April 8th solar Great American Solar Eclipse, and then also the Jupiter Uranus conjunction. So the aspects between the planets in our solar system create cycles, and these cycles seem to have some kind of reverberation. It's like they're that drop in a puddle, and everything kind of reverberates. There's a fantastic book I highly recommend to you and all of your listeners, called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, who is a cultural historian and an associate professor at the Institute for Integral Studies, I believe, in San Francisco. And he created a course, I think it's a PhD course called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Cosmology. And anyway, he talks a lot about these cycles. So the Jupiter Uranus cycle is very important from a cultural standpoint, right? And so we've got one coming up. It is every 14 years, but there's a lot of different pieces to this one. This one happens to be in Taurus. It will definitely sort of like raise up some form of it's kind of like a Renaissance energy.
That's
I
good
did a
though.
talk on like the history of punk of music, but specifically of punk rock music. And we were looking at like different years where really important things happened. 1976 was the year that I focused on, and that happened to be in opposition between Jupiter and Uranus. But in 1969, we had a Jupiter Uranus conjunction. And 1969 musically is so huge, culturally so huge. I think that 2024 is going to like kick off some form of a cultural revolution. And it's definitely going to be about values in the collective.
I
Okay.
like
What do
that.
we really value? What is our priority? And yes, we've got these big picture things, but I have a lot of hope, Michael, because we kind of passed the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 2020, and we're not going to have another Saturn Pluto is about finality. I did a workshop in 2019 getting ready for the Saturn Pluto conjunction of 2020, where it was like, look, shit's going down. It's going to be like authoritative, it's going to be restrictive, it's going to be blah blah blah. And that's what it represents
Yep.
typically. But we have this new epoch, and we don't have another sort of like finality time period for some time. In this particular last cycle that it kind of like ended essentially and begun in 2020, the last time that it really hit the United States and us collectively was 2001, just before 9/11, where we had a Saturn Pluto opposition. It happened to be in Sagittarius Virgo. And now this one, this conjunction is kind of like, I feel like it's like a last gasp for certain forms of authority, okay, and
Hmm.
structure. So we've got a new structure coming in. That's always a chaotic time. Is it the end of an empire? Possibly. But I also don't see a lot of really harsh astrology. Like if you
Good.
would have asked me this 10 years ago, I would have said, honey, buckle up,
And
you
you would have been
know?
right.
And I think there's a lot of change, and it's happening super freaking fast. And yes, I'm a little concerned about what will happen. I think that because there's an element, Saturn is in Pisces right now. It will station. It's been retrograde, and it'll station on the 0 degrees of Saturn's in Pisces. I'm sorry, Saturn is direct in Pisces right now, but Pluto will be at 0 degrees of Aquarius, close to the sun. We're moving into this like Sun Pluto time period, and then we're moving into this time period with Saturn in Pisces. It is like our collective is having to go through this work of really trying to figure out, number one, what we really believe in, what we value, but also more importantly, like we're having to have experiences that bring up compassion in us, because Pisces is very much like about compassion and interconnectedness. Yes, we have a lot of things that separate us, but we have more that bring us together. And unfortunately, it is sometimes through disaster or death or pivotal, difficult situations that we find that. So I think that that's all combining. There will be this sort of like interesting revolution in values. I think it may have something to do with like food and care and
Hmm.
aid and what we care about, and definitely money. Money is definitely up there, like cryptocurrency is still, I think that that will still ultimately be the currency of the future, but it's, just a Wild West time period.
I'm just going to throw one thing on there, and then I have one last thing for you. So when you mentioned health and food and things like that, my feeling, and I said a lot about this, what happened during COVID represented to me an entire breakdown in the trust of institutions, especially the medical profession. And I think they have a lot to answer for. So what you're describing makes sense to me, because I think there's certain things that happen that woke people up to the fact that just because a person with a PhD or a doctorate or some kind of thing at the beginning of their name does not mean that they are the ultimate authority. And so I think that this is just my intuition that what you're saying may be in response to that. My final point I want to make is your website is PersephoneProgram.com.
Yes, PersephoneProgram.com.
And what is the Persephone program?
So when I decided to create this, and I have a podcast as well, Persephone Program Podcast. When I decided to create this business, I also happen to practice astrological magic and magic in general. But I created kind of
well,
like
then we have to talk about that, and we have to talk about that in a whole other.
That's
episode.
A whole other thing. Yeah,
yes.
You know, I created an intent around the work that I wanted to do, which was to transform the shadow into light to a certain extent, and to work with people that have been through the myth of Persephone. Obviously, is that she was, abducted and brought into the underworld, and went from an initiatory. It's an initiatory. It's part of the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, and it's an initiatory myth that talks about a change from a certain kind of naivete and innocence into a relationship with the underworld or the shadow, and then the integration of that and rulership of it, if you will. So I really wanted to create a practice where I was working with people that had been through trauma, that had been through dark passages. And then I wanted to sort of work as like being someone that could shine a light on some of those things, whether it's your interior psyche, your problems, things like that. And so that's why I used Persephone. I saw myself as Persephone. Now I kind of feel like I'm more like the goddess Hecate, which was the goddess that accompanied Persephone to and fro her journey into the underworld. But I used the Greco-Roman mythology of the Queen of the Dead to to name my site and my business.
I like it. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Michelle Prentiss. You can find her at PersephoneProgram.com. Michelle, where else could people find you out there on the wild woolly net?
Yeah, well, you can just Google my name, Michelle Prentiss Astrology. You can email me at michelle.prentiss, PRENTISS @gmail.com. You can find my podcast, Persephone Program Podcast, on all the places, Apple, iTunes, Spotify, blah 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 blah, SoundCloud, which is where I do it, and I'm on Instagram at MY Prentiss or My Prentiss. So yeah, I do all kinds of stuff. I haven't been posting so much lately, but I'll always post about big astrology news, and you can always get a reading from me.
And your blogs are very, very good. The website, ladies and gentlemen, you owe it to yourself to go see this. It's a beautiful website. It's laid out very well. A lot of great content. There's a video that I watched today that I was blown away with. So, Michelle, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your time. Mwah.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you like what we do here at Michael Parker Media, please give us a like, give us a thumbs up, whatever it is on your podcast of choice. Subscribe if you can. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep your heart and your mind open.